centre assessed grades, as that would be in light of everything. That would be the fairest way for students to
just to say, did you ask Ofqual to remove the statement off their website?
No.
No. So they did that, having put it up, they took it off entirely independently of you or anyone in the DFE?
We were very keen for them to be able to expand the scope and widen it to actually include, so that if a valid mock exam had been a higher grade than the centre assessed grade, that be included. Yes, we were keen for that to be included, but I would have hoped that could ultimately have been done through some form of revision ultimately. But I mean, at every stage, I think everyone, whether it be Ofqual, whether it be Department for Education, everyone was taking the steps to ensure that there was maximum fairness for all youngsters who have either both received their grades at A level.
I understand all that. It was just what is confusing is
we were moving towards GCSE awarding day, to ensure that there's as robust a process as possible to ensure where youngsters who hadn't got that were in a position where the grade didn't reflect it. They had a strong
just before I bring in my colleagues, could I ask you, will the department publish or give Ofqual permission to release the minutes of all relevant meetings, submissions and emails between the DFE and Ofqual since 26th of March?
We're very happy to work with, as you'll know, Mr. Chairman, we'd be very happy to work with you and the committee as to what information is required and needs to be released, both from the department and of course with Ofqual as well. And we've always been very open to sort of doing that. There is, as I said in the House just the other week, there is advice that obviously people need to be able to give in a free and frank way, and with the confidence and belief that it would always remain confidential. But we're very happy to work with you to ensure that we do the absolute maximum to ensure as much information that the committee requires is made available to you.
And so this will include the briefing for the number 10 policy unit staff on the 7th of August, prepared by the DFE with input from Ofqual, for example.
That probably wouldn't be something that would be included, but very happy to sort of discuss with your clerks as to the range of advice that and information that you would require.
Okay, I'm going to just pass to Ian Mearns and then Jonathan Gullis. Ian.
Good morning, Secretary of State. You will have no doubt seen or heard about at least our meeting with Ofqual on the 2nd of September. And at that meeting, Julie Swan, who was, I think, the technical director, in response to a question, revealed the existence of an options paper written by Ofqual dated the 16th of March. And the aim would be to ensure students have recognition of learning that they have undertaken, and evidence to support progression was one of the suggestions within that. Now, when the chair of Ofqual also answered a question, he stated that following the submission of this paper to the department, it was the Secretary of State who then subsequently took the decision and announced without further consultation with Ofqual that exams were to be cancelled and a system of calculated grades was to be implemented. And I think that was announced also by the Prime Minister in a press briefing. So Ofqual were consulting with the department, but it was you, Secretary of State, that took the decision. And I think, prior to the summer, this select committee had already raised significant concerns about what the potential implications were going to be of cancelling the exams. Is there anything significant that you would have done differently in hindsight?
So Ian, you raise a very important question, and I think if we were sat here this time last year, none of us could have made the types of predictions as to the events that would unfold, least of all a global pandemic. Prior to the 16th of March, a number of weeks before, obviously when we were seeing a situation of rising infections spreading outside of China and South Korea and Japan, and sort of becoming a more global issue and more of a European issue as well. Quite understandably, we asked Ofqual to look at different options. On the 16th of March, they actually provided options paper, which provided the basis of advice. And if I recall correctly, I think there are 11 options that were outlined there, Ian. And I think that's been sent over to the committee and sort of shared with the committee. Sorry, Ian, wasn't sure if you wanted to come back there, but
yeah. I mean, at what stage did it become clear that by using the algorithm that something like just under 40% of grades would become downgraded, and was that not foreseeable at all? And was there any concern that that would be just publicly unacceptable?
So then on the 17th of March, going back to the original question, but I sort of appreciate the question being thrown in, and I'll come to that. On the 17th of March, we met with Ofqual. It was obviously a very rapidly moving situation. My preference, as I'm sure yours is, Ian, is always to hold a proper form, a full form of moderate, sort of a managed public examination. That is the best form of assessment that we have available. That's why we do it in this country. That's completely and understandably Ofqual's position as well. That's exactly what they would want to see as their first, second, and that's where they'd always like to be. So that was their first option. That was absolutely their preferred option. By their second option was to delay public exams. The advice that we're getting is that the earliest point that we're able to hold exams would be in the September period. This would obviously have quite considerable impacts, because if you're holding exams in September, the impacts of youngsters who had potentially been out of education for a significant period of time would have been significant. The other impact is if we had held the exams in September, my fear was that children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds would be the ones who are most likely to end up with no form of qualification whatsoever. They're the ones who would be most likely to be in a situation where maybe they hadn't actually attended the examination, and 11 or 13 work would never have got anything. So, and sorry, Ian, if I can finish.
Yeah.
And then by the 18th of March, Sally Collier, the chief regulator of Ofqual, was also making it clear to us that the idea of running an exam season wasn't something that they thought was going to be viable in light of the pandemic. And I just wonder, so those decisions then will be made.
One last quick one, Robert. Given that the options paper had 11 options, who took the decision to discount the other 10 from the one that was chosen?
Well, as you'll see by the 11 options that were offered, Ofqual felt that there were only 3 really viable options. Those 3 viable options were to run with the exam season exactly as planned. That became apparent it couldn't be done. Delay until September. That would have felt that it was it would halt people's progression. And the final one that they felt was a viable option, and they felt that there's only 3 key options that were truly viable, and that was through a calculated grade system. And just to pick up on what the chairman of Ofqual said, it's important to recognise that there are no easy choices, there are no easy options, and as he also said,
no, we know that, because we've got to try and be as concise as possible. I'm going to bring in Jonathan Gullis now.
Sorry, Rob, there's a crucial question from what the Secretary of State, just for the record, Secretary of State. You said that there was a meeting with Ofqual on the 17th of March.
That's
now,
correct.
I don't remember Ofqual mentioning that when they met us on the 2nd of September. So is that categorically what happened?
Absolutely. 70. And maybe if I could just bring in Michelle, who is my director. And obviously, as you can imagine, Ian, there was a considerable amount of discussion. Obviously, there's ministerial discussion, but as you will know, there are many different levels and discussions going across the board. And I wonder if Michelle, obviously, if I could just bring Michelle in here, just to give a bit of a sense of what had happened over those few days, which is obviously very important.
I mean, just on the question of the meeting, yes, there was a meeting on the 17th of March with Sally Collier and Michelle Meadows in the room, and that was the critical meeting. And then there were further conversations the following day with Sally Collier, and the Secretary of State phoned Sally Collier in the afternoon of the 18th of March before he made his statement to say what the final decision was.
Just to clarify, the DFE had no involvement in the taking an Ofqual taking down their statement they put up on the Saturday on the 15th of March. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, I very much wanted Ofqual to change that statement to make it wider and more generous. But I very much wanted it to be amended to open that up to make sure that mock exams,
right,
if they were higher than the calculated grade.
So sorry, did you speak to them on the Saturday, the 15th of August, to get them to remove the statement?
I spoke to them to get them to extend the scope and see if that was possible. But I was perfectly happy, as was the department, with the actual statement. But I did want to see if there's an opportunity to be able to widen it even further.
Okay.
But ultimately, that's a decision that ultimately only Ofqual can take. It is not a decision that I can make as Secretary of State. But I certainly, at every stage, wanted to have a system that was, maximises the fairness to the pupils and make sure that we deliver the best opportunities for all young people.
I think that what's coming from this is a blurred lines of accountability and who's responsible for what, and in terms of Ofqual and the Department for Education. And that's why the premise of my question was whether Ofqual is fit for purpose and whether it should just be brought back into the Department for Education. I'm going to pass over to Jonathan Gullis now for his questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I very much share your sentiment with understanding who's sort of to blame. I think you said about when we spoke to Ofqual on the 2nd of September, it ain't us, Gov, was the tone of their letter. And so, Secretary of State, I was wondering if you would be able to tell me, do you believe that Ofqual's reputation is now damaged beyond repair with the teaching profession and with parents and with students?
So if we go back 10 years when we set up Ofqual, it was done absolutely for the very right reasons. Making sure that we have independent regulation, making sure that we have a body that was free from political interference in order to be able to safeguard standards for youngsters and safeguard the integrity of the awarding and examination systems. And Ofqual have done a brilliant job at that and have been consistently very, very good at doing that. I think what we both failed to recognise was the fact that we weren't in peacetime, but we're in a very different situation in terms of the global pandemic. And we needed to have systems and operations that were able to reflect the fact that we're in a very different situation as we went into that sort of global pandemic. And some of the systems and structures that were historically in place were probably not always best designed for when you're in that global pandemic. And it's been very useful and very grateful to Ofqual, and we've been having discussions with them, and they're very keen because we're still in a global pandemic today, but actually how we make sure that we look at how we operate in a different way, because, as you all know, Jonathan, as ministers, you don't see sight of the data. You get the briefing the day before. More information was shared as usual, but actually there's always been exceptionally very clear dividing lines between the department and Ofqual in order to be able to protect the integrity, which is important.
Got it. Jonathan, do you want to come back?
I just wanted to very quickly ask, sorry, Chair, to the Secretary of State, does he feel that were there any ministerial directions that he wished Ofqual had taken more notice of when he was issuing them?
Well, at every stage, we've been dealing with an unprecedented situation. I think that we all wanted to see the outcomes incredibly different to where they are. I think that I was glad on the 6th of August when Ofqual, did change their appeals process. I was glad that they took on board the fact that they needed to, move in terms of a triple lock. But fundamentally, Jonathan, the biggest issue was that there was too many youngsters with a grade that didn't reflect their efforts, and that is why Ofqual ended up having to be in the situation that they were. But there was a, the challenge. There's always got to be doing everything we can do, and this is why I think Ofqual. This is why Ofqual ended up in the position they were in terms of moving to the centre assessed grades, because they realised there are too many young people with a grade that wasn't reflective of their performance, and that was
Okay.
that was the right decision.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State.
Tom Hunt.
Hi. I understand that Ofqual initially wanted to do everything they could for exams still to go ahead. I mean, it was briefly spoken about that it might have to be September, and I completely understand the reasons why that would not have been a desirable outcome. And I also completely understand why the decision was made to cancel exams and for them not to go ahead. And of course, virtually every other country took the same decision that we took. But we do see it in Germany where they actually went ahead with socially distanced exams. I know that their education system is not exactly the same as ours, but it does seem that seemed to go reasonably well in Germany. So I guess my question is just on reflection, and again, I completely understand why in the midst of the pandemic, when we rates of COVID were incredibly high, that decision was made, and of course most of the countries made that decision as well. But on reflection, having look at the example of Germany, might a lot of this have been avoided if we'd gone ahead with sort of socially distanced exams?
Tom, I think that both you and I are firmly of the view that we should always do exams as against calculated grades in the future. But we weren't in a position that we had any level of confidence that we would be able to be in a position where we're able to run those exams. And you're right to highlight Germany, and there are significant logistical challenges in Germany, but there are also examples such as the Republic of Ireland that made the policy decision to run with exams, but then had to abandon them. And I think what people wanted in March was certainty. And my biggest worry that if we had gone ahead with exams was that actually children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, if we'd run ahead with exams in that June, where children, or even in the September, where people would have had such a, potentially quite a significant gap in learning, wouldn't have completed significant elements of the curriculum. And then they were facing the exams. The people who would suffer the most were children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. They're going to be children from, Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. These were the people that, I felt, and all the advice, and actually I think a lot of people also felt, would be the ones who'd be most disadvantaged by running that exam series. And, it was clear the advice that the guidance that we were given is that we couldn't realistically run those exams until the September. It was something that Ofqual recognised that a summer series wasn't going to be a viable option. And then when you're looking at that September situation, and of course people wouldn't have been getting their grades until quite a number of weeks later. It felt like the very best decision in one of the most difficult and sort of challenging situations I think any of us could imagine ourselves in.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, most people have sympathy for the predicament that you were in terms of the whether exams went ahead, especially in the height of the lockdown. Just very briefly before I pass to my colleague, going back to the statement that Ofqual put out on the 15th of August, they said to us in our committee that they did clear it with the Secretary of State's office.
That's right, and I think that they've done an amazing amount of work, in terms of actually getting what is a challenging situation at great speed, in terms of being able to operationalize that system. But and I'd rather that sort of that set of appeals and no set of appeals process go out. But Mr. Chairman, I'm ever so sorry, but I will probably always be one of those people that really continues to push to see if there was a way that we could have maximised the fairness for students. And even though it would have been an exceptionally small number of youngsters who would have been in a situation where their mock exam result had been higher than the centre assessed grades, I still felt that was the best and fairest thing. So I cannot help but wanting to actually push for the fairness at every single stage.
Absolutely, absolutely. But so from what they said they agreed the statement with your department, then put it up on the website, and then you rang them to change it. Is that correct?
What I was constantly wanting to push them to do is to go that bit further, and I would have hoped that if there's a possibility to revise that and open the terms up even a little bit wider, that's of course what I wanted to do. Maybe that's why there was an independent system of regulation that was set up to stop politicians wanting to sort of push for the most generous settlement.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in David Simmons now, please.
Chairman, Secretary of State, I want to ask you a little bit about standardisation. It seems so far, from all the evidence that we've taken, that all concerned have acted in good faith. But there is a question about how effectively joined up the approach was. And you alluded to, but it'd be useful to hear a bit more about any discussions that took place with Scotland and Wales in particular about this, because it seems that everyone was concerned about the impact on the most disadvantaged students, had slightly different systems, but everyone still had broadly similar problems about it, which I think leads to these two questions. The first is that in hindsight, did the department have sufficient oversight of how the standardisation process was working? And then secondly, given the debate we've had about disadvantaged students, the chair of Ofqual gave evidence to the committee that standardisation was better than centre assessed grades for the most disadvantaged students. So the U-turn done in Scotland, had it not still allowed for centre assessed grades and mocks to be taken into account, would have been worse for the most disadvantaged students than sticking with the standardised process. Do you think there's some learning there that in fact, we need, particularly in this political context, to have the independence that says standardisation may in some cases actually be fairer for students rather than centre assessed grades, which are well known for disadvantaging in particular certain groups?
Well, this was very much, and you had 4 home nations effectively reach the broadly same policy position, even though I think it's fair to say quite different political persuasions across all those 4 nations. So, whether it was John Swinney and the SNP up in Scotland, Kirsty as a Liberal Democrat in a Labour administration in Wales, whether it was Peter as DUP in a Sinn Féin and Alliance UU administration in Northern Ireland, we all got to the same position because we were all incredibly concerned about those youngsters who were most going to be disadvantaged by potentially going through a purely teacher assessed grades. And in 2019, 79% of predicted grades were off the actual final grade, so there were concerns about this. But what became apparent, and the evidence, we didn't sort of we don't obviously see the level of information until actually until there was that's released by Ofqual on the day and through centres. It became increasingly clear that while the standardisation was, as you sort of kindly put it, it was sort of done for very much for sort of right reasons. There were clearly some not just individual youngsters, but also schools and colleges that had actually not got quite simply the right set of grades that were reflective of the work. So there was something, it was not just a small number of students, but it was a much more significant and large number of students that went over and above beyond what would able to be dealt with by an appeals process. And I think that's very much what also happened in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Despite the best efforts of Ofqual They tested you know, a large number of different approaches. Despite all that testing, despite all that rigor, they clearly became obvious there were some flaws within that that meant an appeal system couldn't deal with it. But the concept and the idea of calculated grades in terms of actually squeezing out any sort of unfairness was a sort of a fair and decent approach, but it did produce results that weren't fair.
David, do you want to come back on that, David Simmons?
So we heard evidence from Ofqual that they'd looked at 11 or 12 different algorithms in respect of England, and clearly the authorities responsible in the other home nations were doing the same thing. Now, we are one nation when it comes to children's access to education, both cross-border and particularly in terms of the impact on universities. So do you think in future the department needs to have more oversight of what the impact of standardization would be, given that it is something that we will continue to use, albeit in not quite the same way that we did this year?
I think that we do need to have those discussions, and as I've touched upon, Ofqual have actually very much been open to the idea of changing their approach and how they work with the department in terms of any form of approach on these matters, because we do recognise that we've got to operate differently. And I mean, if I could maybe just sort of bring in Michelle, because actually there is quite a standard and quite clear set of sort of lines that aren't really meant to be crossed in terms of handling of information and how that's dealt with. Michelle, I mean, if I could just bring you in here.
Yes, so in a normal year, we get absolutely no information from Ofqual until the Tuesday evening before results come out on a Thursday, and then we work through the night to interpret those results. But all from the point of view of looking at the communication, the handling of those results, absolutely not to be able to influence them. They would already have gone to UCAS. It wasn't that different this year. We did get more information beforehand. Ofqual published some information on the 21st of July. We did have some data right at the end of July to show us the degree of inflation in particular subjects, e.g. music, German, so we could think about the impact on universities. We did have the data that showed what had happened in England vis-a-vis the issue in Scotland, i.e. the degree to which there'd been downgrading by socioeconomic status. But apart from those two instances, I don't think we had any actual data before the A-level week itself, and that is consistent with how we normally work with Ofqual. But I suppose that the thing we now reflect on is was that a workable way to operate with Ofqual in a pandemic? It reflected previous years, but did it work this year, and will it work in the coming year?
Thank you.
And David, really,
David, I'm just going to ask David Simmons if he wants to come back.
I think so. In Parliament, we've had questions thrown really at both ministers and debated widely that say, could we have foreseen that this might have been problematic, and is it fair? And in particular, the charge levelled that standardisation was significantly disadvantaged for the children from the lowest socioeconomic groups. Now, my understanding of the evidence from Ofqual is that the opposite is the case, that standardisation was to the advantage of those disadvantaged groups. So I'm just concerned that, particularly if the data is only coming to the DfE very, very late in the day, that the communications around this creates a very misleading situation that adds to the distress and anxiety of students coming through the system. So maybe the department does need a greater degree of oversight, not necessarily control, but oversight of what's happening, in order to ensure that the way that is communicated continues to command public confidence.
And David, I do agree with you on that. And if I can refer you back to the correspondence I sent on the 31st of March to Ofqual, setting out our policy intention. One of the key elements of that was to ensure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds, children from ethnic minority backgrounds, were not in a situation that they were disadvantaged as a result of this method of awarding. And that was very much at the heart of what Ofqual's approach was, to ensure that you didn't see that disparity or disadvantage as a result of that system.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Christian Wakeford, then David Johnson, then Jonathan Gullis. Christian.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us, Secretary of State. Hopefully a relatively quick one. Obviously, in regards to the process, you've spoken about groups being disadvantaged and how we were trying to avoid that. However, there's one group that's been particularly disadvantaged and remains so, and that's those from those private students and those going through home education. So I was just wondering what consideration either the department or Ofqual gave in regards to those particular cohorts, because they're the ones that seem to have fallen through all the cracks and are now suffering with not being able to go to university or onto the next level of education this year through no fault of their own.
Christian, you're right to highlight them and the difficulty we had, and that's, you know, we just weren't in a position to be able, that there wasn't a policy fix that would able to provide an easy answer for those youngsters. The only route that we could see that we could be able to help and assist is to ensure that we had an autumn series of exams, and this was something that is only taking place in England compared to nowhere else anywhere in the United Kingdom. But that was the only realistic, sensible policy fix that we felt that we could we would be able to bring forward, and that's why we that was one of the influencing factors as to why we did do that autumn series, so that those youngsters will still be able to get an award. But I do appreciate that that comes later, but there hasn't been a simple or easy solution or even a complex solution that actually provides a route for that sort of type of awarding.
Thank you. Christian, are you okay? David Johnston, please.
Thanks, Chair. Secretary of State, most people were pleased with the return to centre assessed grades, but there are a group of parents and young people who are still pretty frustrated by them because they might have been given a particular predicted grade by their school, which was then lowered for the centre assessed grade because they felt from Ofqual that they needed to be in line with historical results. And they now feel in a sort of hugely disqualified and unjust position where they have been given these grades now which they don't feel reflect their potential, and they can't appeal because it's not technically an administrative error. And I wondered what your thoughts are for that group.
Well, we always recognise where you have centre assessed grades, there would be there will always be those youngsters who feel as if that centre assessed grade isn't reflective of their work. This is why we reached the conclusion that it was really important to have a form of examination put in place at the earliest possible moment, and realistically that was the autumn series, because we felt that that was the best form of appeal, and that's why the ability to sort of do that was always going to be have their costs covered, so there'd be no cost to either the school or the college or to the student itself, because effectively it is the ultimate arbiter and the ultimate appeals process that we were able to offer, that's what drove the policy decision to do that.
And I can see that, although obviously by the time they do that, some things they were planning to go on to, they maybe can't now go on to. I wonder if you feel, I mean, if a school feels that it was perhaps too strict in the way that it downgraded those predicted grades when it submitted its centre assessed grades. I mean, the big problem here is that people are saying some schools were very strict at putting it in line with historical data and others weren't. And that's what they feel is the unfairness if they were at one of the schools that was very strict. And I wonder if you feel a school could appeal to Ofqual if it feels in retrospect it was overly strict because it felt it had been encouraged to be so.
That isn't a route that would be realistic or probably equally. I don't think it's a route that's realistically one that we could go down. And I think you would find, and maybe this is me, maybe I'm being a bit too cynical, David, but I think you would find that every school would decide that they had been too strict on their calculated, so their centre assessed grades. And I think you would have every school submitting again, but the reason that we'd gone down the route of calculated grades was to do everything we can do to eliminate unfairness and eliminate sort of variances that may well emerge. But I'm afraid that I don't think it's, from a policy point of view, I don't think it's realistic to then open up for schools to start resubmitting all their calculated grades again.
Okay, have you done, David? Thank you. Very quickly, Jonathan Gullis, you promised 20 seconds because others haven't spoken yet.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I just wanted to check, because I asked Ofqual, when you saw what happened in Scotland, albeit them using a slightly different system, what action did you and the DfE take with Ofqual to prepare and double check over what the results were going to be in the week's time?
Yeah, well, as we sort of obviously, when we saw what happened to Ofqual, one of the key areas of debate was the downgrading of children from the most socially deprived areas being, incredibly much more significant downgrades for those children compared to those children from more affluent socioeconomic areas. So one of the key things that we obviously work very closely with Ofqual and put an awful lot of challenge that wasn't something that was going to be repeated. Ofqual were already in the process of actually taking measures to the enhanced appeal system, changes to that appeal system. That was what was implemented on the 6th of August. And then what we announced in terms of the triple lock policy on the 12th of August was very much in line with actually doing everything we can do to ensure that there was maximum fairness in the system. And but we had got the reassurances, consistent reassurances that some of the unusual nature of results that had occurred in Scotland, and especially the downgrading of youngsters from the most disadvantaged areas, that wasn't something that was going to be common in England. And I think that was a similar reassurance that sort of also was given in Wales and Northern Ireland. And it was important also that we have a sort of a broadly similar approach in terms of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, because obviously you've got the common awarding of GCSEs, A levels and AS levels across all of those three nations.
Ian, you had a quick...
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I'm just listening very carefully to all of this, Secretary of State, and I think there is a problem which is really kind of swirling around in the back of my mind, and that is that both yourself, your predecessors, and your schools minister are constantly telling us in Parliament and in the country that we have more children being educated in good and outstanding schools than ever before. We have the most professional teaching profession that we've ever had, and yet we're not expected to have year on year any significant level of what's classified as grade inflation. I mean, and it seems to me that a large part of this mess has come about because there was a sort of prime directive that whatever we did, we had to avoid grade inflation in the process. Now, as a result, we've actually got a situation where some schools really do feel like they've played by the rules and submitted what they think are accurate centre assessed grades based on the historical data that I had to adhere to, and they feel that others didn't. So, you know, it is such a mess. But why aren't we allowed to have grade inflation if we've got more children in good and outstanding schools than ever before, and a more professional teaching profession than ever before? Shouldn't that be inherently an improving system?
Okay.
Ian, thank you for your question, and I'm equally, like my predecessors, and I know you are, very proud of the progress that schools and the teaching profession has made over not just for the last 10 years, but over many decades in terms of what they offer all of our children. We do allow grade inflation. We saw grade inflation in terms of the calculated grades. You know, we saw more youngsters achieving A's and A stars. We've just seen more youngsters achieving 9s and 8s before. And actually, if we go back to my correspondence and direction letter on the 31st of March, it did rightly highlight the importance of you know, sort of children from disadvantaged and ethnic minority backgrounds. It also highlighted the importance of standards as well. But actually within that, you know, we saw grade inflation with the calculated grades. And actually, we also saw the fact that without any form of any other correspondence coming from me, that Ofqual were able to move into a position of actually even more substantial grade inflation going into the system than had been would usually be the case. So, you know, grade inflation was allowed. You know, you saw that from the fact of the initial awarding, and then when those were reissued, and the fact that there was nothing further that had to come from me in order to give them the clearance to do that.
But there's a significant concern, particularly amongst those head teachers who honestly, professionally feel that they and their school played by the rules, and they feel that maybe possibly others, because of that inherent grade inflation that was seen in terms of the centre assessed grades. So what can we do to compensate the youngsters in those schools where the head teachers fundamentally believe that they played by the rules and submitted, you know, their own moderated grades to Ofqual?
Well, this is why it was important that we said, you know, we expect all schools to play by the rules and to behave in a proper and honourable sort of manner. The reason that we said calculated grades or centre assessed grades, whichever is highest, we thought that was important because there's, you know, 3% of youngsters had their grades increased as a result of calculated grades. So we wanted to ensure that those stood. But this really comes down to the core of it, is what is the best and fairest form of assessment. And the best and fairest form of assessment is proper form of examination that youngsters are able to take in controlled conditions. And that is why it is important that we get back into that position at the earliest possible moment.
Just before I pass on to my next colleague, just when you had the warnings from Sir John Cole, even our Select Committee report and others are worried about the algorithm, what way in advance of it being published, what did you do?
So you mentioned Sir John Coles, and Sir John wrote to me, and I know he'd been making representations to Ofqual. I sat down with Sir John and listened to his concerns. Minister Nick Gibb, also following that, also sat down with Sir John, actually and then following that had an emergency meeting with Ofqual over the concerns.
So did you ask Ofqual to make changes or not?
And actually, out of those meetings, out of obviously consideration of the report that the Education Select Committee, that was very much what drove the changes to the appeals process on the 6th of August, in terms of listening to those concerns and making sure that they're properly taken on board.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to pass to Apsana now, please, and then Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Chair. So I had a few questions really about some of the sort of ongoing concerns. And firstly, I wanted to sort of find out your views in terms of the lack of topic level optionality in the majority of GCSE subjects and all A-level subjects. And concerns that would sort of lead to greater inequality and undermine the credibility and validity of results next summer. So it'd be really helpful to know from your thoughts on that, Secretary of State. And also sort of, I know we're going to come on to this a little bit later, but the sort of the lack of preparation for, and that would be caused sort of as a result of local and national lockdowns under the current proposals. And, the feeling that there isn't a huge amount of preparation for a planned system of moderated CAGs should exams be suspended nationally or locally again next year. And Secretary of State, I just wanted to also know, the government is seen to be sort of ploughing ahead with league tables, or as sort of the government calls it, performance tables in 2021. The associated sort of pressures and impacts that this would create for schools, colleges and students when it comes to exams is going to be quite immense, I should think. But I just want to know why that the government is sort of ploughing ahead with that, and if you had any views on that as well that you could share with us. Thank you.
Of course, thank you ever so much. And you're right to highlight, there'll be many communities that are in a situation where they're experiencing more tighter restrictions in terms of movement than others. But this is why at every stage that very much the last thing to be closing is our schools, because we realise how important it is that we do everything we can to ensure children continue to get the education they deserve. This is also why back on the 2nd of July, as part of the guidance that we issued, we talked about the importance of continuity of education. And in those, what we would hope would be a very small number of areas, and hopefully no areas at all, but where people's the running of education is impacted as a result of COVID, is actually ensuring that that there is a continuity of education that's continued to be provided by the school. This is why we're investing the extra money in even further laptops to make sure that schools where they've got children who are from a disadvantaged background and may not have resources at home are able to call off on a stock so that they're able to continue their education at home. This is why we continue to make the investments that we have in the Oak National Academy to ensure that there can be a continuity of education that is provided. And we'll continue to work with the whole sector to put as much resource that is needed and required to help them to deliver that continuity of education. In terms of the broader pressures that schools face, this is something I'm incredibly conscious of, and we realise that we're asking schools to, and teachers and teaching assistants and all the support staff to make a heroic effort in terms of opening up and welcoming millions of children back. That's why we've, as Ofqual starts to do visits, they're not doing inspection visits. This is why we're continuing to work with the sector to make sure that we're not putting added and undue pressures on them, but they can be focusing on the job in hand. But it is important that we do start to look towards the future as to how do we ensure that the sort of measures of accountability are returned, but making sure that this is sympathetic and empathetic with the challenges that the sector are currently facing.
Thank you.
Can I just come back a couple?
Please.
Yeah, can I just come? So, I do feel that there is sort of a lack of understanding shown by suggestions that, for example, A-level students will not need topic level optionality simply because they're sort of older or possibly more motivated. In terms of, the fact also that open book elements of exams, such as having access to formula sheets in science exams or poetry, anthologies in English literature exams and so forth, they've been sort of dismissed as out of hand. So just want to know if, just looking at the fact that students are already entering GCSE, AS or A-level exams, sort of unreasonably sort of expected to cover the full course when obviously through no fault of their own or their school or their college, they've not had access to the amount of learning that they, that would allow them to have done so. So they're already in a sort of disadvantaged place as it is. And I just sort of wondered if you're sort of aware of these kind of limitations of the current proposals.
Well, this is why we continue to work with Ofqual and the exam boards, as well as the broader sector, to make sure that we put in place as much support as possible to ensure that children going into 2021 exam series, whether that's at GCSE, A level, AS level, are not in a position where they're sort of disadvantaged. I know this is something that the whole sector and Ofqual is incredibly aware of, and that's why we'll continue to work with them to make sure that we have a set of policy options that do the absolute maximum to ensure that youngsters, wherever they're from, are not disadvantaged.
Are you finished up, Sana? Thank you. Kim, sorry, you've been waiting.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State. I think we can all agree that the exam grading process over the summer was a complete fiasco. The use of predicted grades is a major barrier for Black students, and these students are disproportionately receive grades that don't reflect their final achievement, making it harder for them to gain entry into higher tariffed universities. Many have forced to defer their place this year. Can you give any assurance that additional funding will be allocated to universities next year to allow them to offer places to all those who met the criteria? And secondly, can you explain what advice your previous permanent secretary gave you over the direction that you took, and why the Prime Minister felt there was a need for fresh official leadership in the department? Thank you.
Kim, sorry, I wasn't sure. Are you in favour of calculated grades or in favour of centre assessed grades? It wasn't quite clear from the question. I wasn't sure if you were against both or in favour of both. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Kim.
You're muted. Oh yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, Kim. I wasn't quite sure from your question as to, are you in favour of centre assessed grades or calculated grades? I wasn't sure if you were against both or for both.
Centre, the first one.
So you're in favour of calculated grades for process that we actually went down?
No.
Okay, so are you in favour of centre assessed grades?
Yeah.
But then you also said that they disadvantage children from...
Well, I think, we as a committee provided advice and guidance in terms of how we felt that some students were going to be unfairly affected by the route that you took. But that's why we'd gone down the calculated grades route, because we were concerned that youngsters from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, from ethnic minority backgrounds, would be the ones who are potentially most, historically, most studies that have been carried out found that these youngsters, through effectively predicted grades or centre assessed grades, were the ones that were most impacted. And that's why one of the key reasons as to why we've gone down calculated grades. So I'm not quite sure what you're making an argument for, as to whether you're making an argument for a calculated grade system that is, maybe just, sort of done slightly differently, or whether you're arguing for centre assessed grades. But I mean, maybe put that to one side. But I mean, this is why we'd gone down this is why we'd gone down the route of going down calculated grades, because of your concerns. Your exact concerns that you had were the same concerns that we had about those youngsters from those deprived backgrounds, from children from backgrounds, from BAME backgrounds as well, because the studies had sort of steered us in that route. That's why it was really important that we had the calculated grades. If they were higher than the predicted grades, from those centres, that those were the grades that still stood. Because, as I say, historical analysis had always shown
that that children from those backgrounds were the ones who suffered more. So that's why we couldn't just flip straight to a centre assessed grades. It was really important that actually those calculated grades still stood, because there are a lot of youngsters from those backgrounds that were maybe going to be disadvantaged. And, you know, in terms of the off-qual qualification that was sort of run earlier on in the year, this was something that was, you know, backed by all the unions, because exactly the same concerns that you and I had were the concerns that they had. It was the reason why the deputy leader as the Labour Party, deputy leader of the Labour Party and then Shadow Education Secretary, claimed as a great victory the fact that we were moving to calculated grades, because Labour felt it was the right system. And it's right why probably all four nations of the United Kingdom ended up in a sort of very similar policy decision, because of the concerns that you've got or the concerns that we have. Moving on to the issue that you flag of universities, we're already working with the university sector to make sure that we maximise capacity for youngsters who want to go to university. We saw swift action taken this year, removing the caps on medical, dentistry, veterinary places, making sure that there was as much capacity there. And I have no doubt that we are already working with the sector to make sure that we're in the best possible place for all youngsters, whatever their background, to be able to take advantage of our brilliant higher education institutions for next year as well. But I very much take on board your point and your request. I think I got the impression you were almost going into a spending review bid.
No. But just going back to the centre assessed grades, they were standardised to reflect past performance of schools, which doesn't allow for high performing individual students from Black backgrounds or low income backgrounds. So the exclusion is further entrenched by underlying assumptions. So the decision was taken not to allow appeals against a whole school CAG by affected pupils. Why was this taken, and who took it?
Well, so we were always clear that, as we move to a system where there is calculated grades, if we move to a system, we've got calculated grades and centre assessed grades that are both there in terms of actually whichever is highest. We tested the impact on the algorithm on different centre types, with different proportions of candidates from very much from different backgrounds and socioeconomic status. And, in terms of the calculated grades, again, it was felt that those youngsters from those backgrounds weren't disadvantaged. In terms of actually the appeals process that we've put in place, effectively, we've moved to the system that is of the absolute maximum generosity in terms of whether that is whichever is highest calculated grades or centre assessed grades. And then when we look at university admissions and capacity next year, we've already allocated additional teaching grant funding to be provided to increase capacity in medical, nursing, STEM and other high cost subjects, very much to ensure that youngsters from all backgrounds aren't disadvantaged as a result of what's happened this year, and making sure that we add, sort of add as much capacity into the system, and providers are able to bid up to an extra £10 million worth of funding in order to be able to provide that capacity.
I think in terms of the answers to those questions, that at the end of the day, young people in those categories are still going to be extremely disaffected by what happened over the summer. And as much money that you talk about being issued, often it doesn't get to the right people at the right time. Thank you, Secretary of State. They're all my questions at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Absana, did you want to come back? Or?
No, I think we're keen to move to the next question.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go to Jonathan Gullis now, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is regarding BTECs, which appear to have been a secondary thought in this whole process. And I'd like to know, what oversight did the department have regarding the situation with BTEC results and the 450,000 students whose results were delayed?
Well, Jonathan, can I absolutely assure you, technical vocational qualification is very much ingrained on my heart, and BTECs are incredibly important to us, as is the rollout of our T levels that we're seeing this month as well. There is a slightly different approach in terms of the regulation of BTECs and awarding bodies. What was clear that there had to be the same level of fairness on the awarding of technical and vocational qualifications, including BTECs, as was the case in, as has been the case in GCSEs and A and AS levels. It became clear to us that when Pearson said that they weren't going to be in a position because they felt the need to be able to, they had to change some of the grading on BTECs, that they wouldn't obviously able to hit that Thursday deadline that we would have obviously wanted them to do.
Secretary of State, sorry, very quickly on that point, because the big issue that's come to me from exam officers, who I know that you have, you've said, you know, you thanked for all their hard work, was the fact that the day before results were announced at 5 p.m, Pearson sent out the email basically saying that there was going to be a delay. Do you not agree that that was really shoddy from Pearson? And to be quite frank, meant that a lot of hard work to print the results suddenly in some schools was lost, or then we're going to have to print a whole new notice to put in with results to say, please ignore the BTEC results. I mean, it was just, I went to a few schools on results day, and it was a fiasco, and students being told, this is the grade we think you're going to get, but please ignore it because it might not end up being that one. It was really shoddy, especially for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds in areas like Stoke-on-Trent, where BTECs have a much higher take-up than other parts of the country. It meant a lot of students weren't able to progress onto their next stage.
Secretary, just as an aside to that, what I didn't understand was on the day, Ofqual said, when there was the change in policy, it said that the one line about BTEC saying they wouldn't be affected, when it was clear that there was going to have to be some kind of change. And, you know, especially given that there were 450,000 students, not by you, but appeared to be forgotten about. And I know you care very deeply about this issue and technical qualifications. So I'm not laying this at your door, but I just felt that the way BTECs were treated, it came over as a sort of forgotten part of our education system.
It's certainly when I had my discussions with Pearson's earlier on in the week, there was no sense that this would be a problem. If I could maybe bring Michelle in on this point, actually, if Michelle, you're able to just comment as to the situation that we ended up finding ourselves in.
My understanding from Pearson's point of view was that they did not originally think that they needed to make changes on the back of the changes that we made to A levels and GCSEs, but when they looked at it more closely, they thought that the processes that they had been through would not stand up to public confidence, and therefore they changed their position. I think it was on the Wednesday, and they told us that afternoon.
Obviously that we're not in a position where we can actually tell Pearson's as to what to do, either which sort of way on this, but obviously our preferred option, goes without saying, would have been that BTECs and GCSEs were all released on the same day. But if there's a situation where youngsters would potentially have had a higher grade as a result of changes that Pearson's would have made, it was equally right that those youngsters get the benefit of that higher grade than not getting it.
It was clear there was going to be some kind of domino effect, though, and the statement on the day perhaps should have been slightly different from Ofqual about BTECs.
I think that's a very valid point, and it was something that was highlighted to Pearson's, and on the Wednesday they decided to take that action.
Caroline, you've been waiting a very long time.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, good morning. I would like to ask you a couple of questions. Firstly, about next year's exams. The students, particularly sitting GCSEs, A-levels, BTECs next year, are very worried about whether the same thing has happened this year is going to happen to them, and they would like some reassurance. You've published some changes to the curriculum of some exams in some subjects. Can you reassure students that those changes are final, that what they're now being asked to study will be what they're examined on in 8 months' time, and the curriculum won't change in the meantime?
Well, certainly we've got no plans on major curriculum change, which will be a relief, I'm sure, to both yourself, to children, to parents, and to the whole education sector. We continue to work with Ofqual to make sure that some of the challenges, and Ofqual did an extensive consultation back on the 2nd of July in terms of different changes that they were looking at. And we're also continuing to do quite a substantial body of work to make sure that the lessons that come out of awarding of this year are properly learned, and actually any changes that we need to make to ensure maximum fairness for youngsters are undertaken. I mean, I wonder if I can just take, Mr. Chairman, if I can beg your leave, to have the opportunity to bring in Susan, who's our acting permanent secretary of the department, who is leading a body of work in terms of actually dealing with some of these issues, because we're just so incredibly conscious that how important it is that youngsters going into 2021 are in the very best possible position to succeed, because in many respects they're the ones who will have suffered the maximum amount of
Thank you. No problem. Susan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll try and be brief. So what I've tried to do since arriving in the department is set up a piece of work looking at the students who will take exams in 2021 and trying to bring together not just the work on awarding and qualifications, but also making sure we're also being very attentive to them in thinking about lost learning and how we are supporting schools to help them to catch up, and making sure that we've also thought about their progression and the work that we do with universities and other destinations. And I'm keen that we do that work in the round and we really look at all of the aspects of the experiences those students will have, because as members of the committee will be hearing, I'm also hearing, and the Secretary of State is also hearing from those students and their parents about their anxieties. I think one thing that we've put as a very firm stake in the ground is that, just as we have said, we will do everything we can and make it a national priority to keep our schools, colleges and other places of learning open as far as we possibly can through this pandemic. We will do our absolute utmost to make sure that exams take place effectively next summer, and we're putting everything we can think of in place around that to make sure that we can keep going and make those exams go ahead successfully.
Thank you. It's great to hear that you're looking so closely at this group. It is about 8 months until they're due to sit the exams, and there have been some published changes to books that may be read in English literature and topics that may be chosen in history. What I guess I was trying to get clarity from is are those changes the final changes, so students can now throw themselves into 8 months of learning that set of topics without worrying that they will be changed in some way?
Yeah, they can very much sort of throw themselves in.
Thank you, Secretary. That's really, really helpful. Permanent Secretary, you talked about the dates, and I wondered if Secretary of State could talk us through what he's thinking about with regard to the dates of exams. To my mind, it would seem sensible to make the exams slightly later as far as possible, to give students who have lost time of learning extra time to catch up in school. Have you given that consideration, and what plans have you got in place to ensure that things can be, more people who mark the exams could be recruited in time for next summer, so that the exams can be marked quickly and despite being delayed, and in time for the university UCAS session?
So we're very much having that active consideration and discussion. We Ofqual on the 2nd of July consulted, I think it was page 15 of their consultation document, about the idea of moving back exams to maximise learning time. We do equally have, I suppose, the challenge of if we're wanting people to be able to progress onto university to college, that it does limit the amount of shift that you can do, but it is something that we're actively considering. will be, I would love to share the sort of details with that, all of that with you now, Caroline, but just not quite in a position, because we don't see it as just a single and sole thing that is needed to help, and it would be part of something much more within the round. But we are very actively looking at that and sort of leaning at how we can maximise the time youngsters can learn, but in a sort of a thoughtful and sort of limited manner.
Thank you, Secretary of State. A final question in relation to the timing of next year's exams. Some students will no doubt be concerned that they would be subject to track and trace or unwell and having to isolate to protect the rest of the public on the date of their specific exam in a specific subject. Ofqual spoke to us about having 2 sessions of equally rigorous exams, or perhaps more. And also the normal spacing of desks is 1.25 metres, as I understand it. And we would probably want people to be further apart and need more halls and more invigilators in order to achieve that. Have you got plans in place to deal with that? Because you have time at the moment to do so.
Yeah, so we're very much looking at that, very much taking on board what Ofqual has said about maybe needing to have a reserve set of papers for youngsters who, as you've highlighted, may not be in a position to be able to take that examination, and obviously it wouldn't be possible for them to take the same examination just a few weeks later. So we are very aware of that. We're very conscious of that. We're planning for that. We're also planning for the fact that there may need to be a different approach in terms of creating extra capacity within schools and a wider use of public buildings for exam centres, if that is required and that is needed in local communities as a result of further social distancing.
When do you expect to be able to update the committee and indeed the students and teachers who'll be organising for these exams with the final information?
It'll be in the very near future, Caroline.
Good. Thank you, Secretary of State. If I could possibly move on to...
Caroline, before we do that, some colleagues want to ask about exams. So then I'll bring you back if that's okay. Start off with David Simmons.
It's a logistical question. One of the pieces of evidence from Ofqual was that the advice they'd given about exams had gone in initially to the Department of Health and Social Care. Are you confident that the DFE is in control of all the different pieces of advice going into government, and that we're not going to see a decision made in another government department in the light of advice they've received negatively impacting on decisions which are very much within the domains of the DFE?
David, you highlighted a challenge that when you're dealing with quite a situation that we are, we do have to take consideration and proper regard of the views of other departments. And obviously in a global pandemic, you're in a situation where the Department for Health, what Public Health England and what the Department for Health think are important measures to control the pandemic actually become clear and overriding considerations as part of what you're doing in terms of delivery. But this is very much aimed to be done in a joined up manner. And I equally think we would face quite a lot of considerable criticism, probably not just from the committee, but more widely, if we weren't taking those health considerations on board. But I have every confidence that we will, the decisions we make, will be very much focused on delivering the best sort of educational outcomes and fairness for students. But I believe that can be done while also taking on board the considerations and concerns and requirements of other departments, notably the Department for Health, especially when we're in this pandemic situation.
Thank you. Tom Hunt, please.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Yes, I think it is about just providing that 100% certainty to schools and pupils as soon as possible that come what may, exams will go ahead. So, I mean, I would want us to go a bit further than we are today, and I'm glad that soon you'll be able to hopefully communicate that. And I just like to make sure. I mean, I think you're in a pretty good place when it comes to the importance of exams, but I think it's just stressing, because I have seen some people try and use this as a bit of an opportunity to sort of push back against the importance of exams. And somehow it's been communicated that exams are these sort of really nasty things. And I get many people get stressed by exams, but I'd also like to point out that, you know, for many people they work, and particularly often for unconventional learners, and lots of dyslexic and dyspraxic peoples actually really welcome exams because they do things in their own way. So if there is this sort of pushback against exams and how this is a whole opportunity to review a whole roll of exams, etc., just that you will be robust in pushing back against that, and bear in mind that many SEND peoples actually prefer exams. I know each people's different, but just bearing that in mind.
Tom, I have actually repeatedly said in the House of Commons that we are going ahead with exams next year. Sadly, sometimes if you announce things in the House of Commons, not everyone always notices it, but we've been very, very consistent in terms of that. I think you raise a really important point. There are some people who would try to use this crisis to undo some of the important progress that has been made in terms of quality and the rigor of examinations and the importance that examinations need to play in part of the assessment. I think what is so clearly evidenced by over the last few months of how important exams are, how that there is no perfect system, but how they are by far and away so much better, leagues better than any other form of system that anyone can come up with. And that's why it's so vital, so important that, you know, whether, you know, we get exam series up and running for 2021.
Got it. Jonathan, very quickly, if you can, please.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I just want to make sure that Ofqual mentioned as a plan B or plan C the idea of creating some sort of super online testing a way of doing it on exams online. Can you alleviate the nightmares I've been having since I heard that and guarantee me that we will not be trying to create some massive online system which inevitably will completely muck up? And as you've already reiterated, exams is the only thing students need to be thinking about for next year.
Very much exams. We will look at making sure that there's backups for exams. So hypothetically, if let's say in a local area it wasn't feasible to run exams in a town or a city, making sure that we do have a backup on that. But I'd like to reassure you that there aren't any algorithm plans.
Just before I pass to Caroline, the schools minister said in response to me in the House, or it may have been to you, that I asked a question about early assessment during September of pupils in schools to find out how much loss of learning there has been. So then you know how delayed the exams need to be and what you need to do to the syllabus. Is that going to happen? I know you've got a long-term plan in terms of catch-up, but I'm talking about specifically those years, sort of some kind of national assessment to help you determine your decision.
Mr. Chairman, you're right to highlight this and the importance of it. We actually just concluded a contract in order to be able to roll this out. It won't be. It will be something that isn't every single pupil. It's sort of taking a very large, substantial slice of pupils, and it isn't just right at the start of the year, but it's something to continue through the year, so we can actually be measuring progression as well.
Will you be able to do it enough to inform your decision about the timetable of exams in next year?
Very much so, but if I can bring Susan in on this point, if that's okay as well. But yes, we would be expecting to see that being able to be informing us on all our decisions.
Because the teachers need to know now, especially what parts of the syllabus to teach and so on.
If I could just bring in Susan.
Yes, I beg your pardon, Susan.
Sorry, I was just going to give a little bit more detail on the work that we've done. So as the Secretary of State has said, we've commissioned an independent research and assessment agency to provide that kind of assessment of the catch-up needs, and it'll take a sample of pupils from years 1 to 11. So it'll look across the whole pupil population, and it'll allow us to understand more about how different groups of pupils have been affected, as well as about the kind of average effects. We will use that principally for research purposes. So we've wanted to be very clear with schools that we're not using it as any form of accountability or assessment for schools, but of course we will also want to use that to inform our decision making. I think in terms of informing next summer's exam series, on some of these decisions, the priority, as the committee has emphasised, is to make sure that while we need to make really good, well-informed decisions, and also to make sure that we're consulting all of the people who need to be part of that, that students and parents need to know soon what we're doing. So I'm not sure how far we will get detailed information from that work before we make decisions about exam timing, because that is a decision we know we need to make soon in order to make sure everyone's suitably prepared for the work that they need to do between now and then. But in a sense, the principle that we want to extend the amount of learning time as much as possible without knocking into the time that is needed for pupils to progress into their next step means the gearing is the same in a sense. You'd want to extend the time by as much as you can without messing up what happens across the summer.
And do you think you'll know about the exam timetable by October?
I think the Secretary of State said very shortly. And
yes, but that in Whitehall terms can mean quite a few things.
Mr. Chairman, I think very shortly is definitely the month of October.
Okay, that's good news, I think, and we welcomed. Ian, a very quick one before Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, this whole situation regarding exams, we've got to remember that Ofqual themselves have previously expressed the view that probably about 25% of grades awarded every year are inaccurate. So about 12.5% too high, about 12.5% too low. And there's an inherent unfairness within that. So thinking for the long-term Secretary of State and new permanent secretary, what are we going to do about that? Because, you know, through this process, through this summer, we were told that the grades awarded would be reliable, a grade either side. But since Ofqual already have told us that annually 25% of grades are probably inaccurate, what are we going to do about that inherent fairness? Because we know that some people are more likely to be able to fund an appeal more than others.
Well, Ian, at every stage, you know, the best way of making sure that you have the best, you know, give youngsters the best chance to succeed is continue to drive on our mission of standards and quality within education, within schools, in terms of how the curriculum is taught, making sure it's a knowledge-rich curriculum. All of these things will go a long way to making sure that children can perform the best they possibly can do.
But Secretary of State, that's not about the grade that they're actually awarded on an exam that they actually take. And Ofqual have admitted that about a quarter of all grades are inaccurate.
In 2019, 79% of predicted grades provided by schools ended up being different to the exam result that they had. There is always going to, you know, but what is clear, the exam system is the fairest and best system that is available to us.
Sorry, Secretary, I think you're missing the point. Ofqual have admitted that 25% of the grades awarded, if reassessed by a senior examiner, would be given a different grade. In other words, 25% are inaccurate, and it might be up or it might be down. That's an inherently unfair system. Of the 350,000 appeals which are put in every year, about 80% of those appeals are against grades which are accurate, not against the inaccurate ones. So we've got to do something about that. It's inherently unfair.
But Ian, this is why it's so important to have a robust appeal system. That's why it's important that schools are able to appeal. You know, schools, you know their pupils. If they don't feel that that's right, they have the ability to do that, and they can do whatever people's background is. That they can they do that at no cost to the pupil.
I know that you're very interested in fairness, Secretary of State, but in a situation where 25% of grades are assessed to be wrong every year and only 1% of grades are altered upwards, that's just inherently still unfair. That needs a proper review, not only by Ofqual, but by yourselves.
But this is why Ofqual every single year does more and more work with exam boards to ensure there's a consistency of marking and the fairness of marking. That's the right approach to do to make sure that you maximize the fairness in the exam system. I'm not quite sure as to what the alternative. to actually having exams that you're sort of proposing to?
I'm going to move on now, Ian. I'm going to move on.
Sorry, Rob. The Secretary of State asked me what I'm proposing. What I'm proposing is carry on doing exams, but have them marked accurately. You know, what I'm saying to you is Ofqual themselves.
I think we're remarkably in exactly the same position, Ian. And we'll certainly push Ofqual, the exam boards, to make sure there's the maximum fairness, the maximum amount of consistency. You know, this is why we ended up creating an independent regulator back in the early part of the last decade.
Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, when you took the decision to close the schools on the 20th of March, it was just before, a week or so before the Easter break. But guidance was published for schools in telling them how they may provide online provision or at-home provision on Sunday the 19th of April, just before they returned back to school. The headmasters and headmistresses and all the other teachers and worked very hard over the Easter holidays to try and see what they might be able to do to continue to teach their children at home. Do you think the department performed well in setting clear standards and clear expectations of what remote learning should look like, what progress checks should be made, and what well-being checks should be made on students that were more vulnerable?
Yeah. So I think we did a number of quite exceptional things that were actually sort of really sort of led the sector, whether it's the fact that when we had the closure of schools to all pupils, we actually kept them open, not just for critical workers, not just for those important NHS, children of important NHS staff, and such as yourself and many others, but we also took the decision, and we're one of the first countries anywhere in the world to keep them open for vulnerable children as well, children who are the most disadvantaged. I think that was a really important step in terms of the guidance that we issued for schools, in terms of actually getting them and steering them towards actually making sure they do the maximum amount of provision. I think that was the right thing to do. I think as we look at the guidance on the 2nd of July, in terms of setting even further expectations of what's delivered, I think that's also the right thing to do. But then if we look at the innovations, such as the Open National Academy, which has delivered over 16 million lessons in their time in sort of operation, it goes to show that there's been some real innovation that's come forward. But we've seen schools do things absolutely brilliantly. But what I do want to do is drive up the consistency across the board to make sure that all schools are doing an absolute minimum, and that's and driving up those standards. I think this is why it's really important that this is one of the things that Ofsted will be assessing as part of their inspections going forward of schools as to how they provided that provision.
Thank you, Secretary of State.
I mean, just an observation.
Committee's heard quite a lot about. Sorry.
Go ahead, Caroline.
Sorry. Secretary of State, the committee has heard quite a lot about variable provision. I've heard some fantastic things about lessons from the Oak National Academy, for example, and some teachers and schools going very far above and beyond what may have been expected. But sadly, we've also heard that 1 in 5 children have done no work or less than an hour per school day. The Children's Commissioner spoke to this committee about the lack of consistency, and perhaps most worryingly, we heard that 14% of foster carers looking after some of the country's most vulnerable children, where those children had not been able to go into school for particular reasons, had not also been able to access any work despite trying with the schools. Do you regret that Ofsted weren't more involved in inspections during the pandemic, where other countries have managed to do that in a very supportive way to support schools in providing a better provision at home where they've not been able to do so?
So Caroline, I mean, this is why we're particularly targeted vulnerable children and actually done a lot of work, not just with schools, but also social workers, local authorities, and actually getting vulnerable children back into schools. And I was very pleased, when we've seen the attendance data, children from the most vulnerable backgrounds, their attendance at school is broadly in line with children of all other backgrounds, and it's important. But this is why we are bringing back Ofsted visits. We we recognise that we had to take quite significant changes, and certainly as schools were closing, it didn't seem the right thing to be continuing with Ofsted inspections during the height of the pandemic. But Ofsted have been very closely deployed through REACT teams in terms of working with local authorities and schools. But then as we move in this September to a return to the more normal and formal role of Ofsted, I think this is the right moment to do it.
Thank you. So, out of interest, what percentage of vulnerable children were attending school throughout the pandemic?
So the percentage of I believe that the children who were attending school from, on the latest figures who were coming to school, it was within a plus or minus of 1 of the overall attendance levels. And I think that we had somewhere in the region of 75,000. Let me just check that sort of we had roughly about 75,000 vulnerable children who were attending school at the height of the pandemic.
Wasn't it just for about 85% that were not attending during the lockdown?
Well, as you'll know, Mr. Chairman, in terms of the umbrella that we sort of created for those youngsters that were able to, there was a very wide umbrella, and some of those children with very special educational needs where it wouldn't have obviously been suitable to go into that. But we had a much significantly higher rate of vulnerable children attending school right the way through than any of the other home nations, and I believe any other nation anywhere else in Europe. So we were much more successful getting vulnerable children into school than anyone else.
Right. But despite the brilliant efforts of the Oak Academy, there were still over 2 million children who didn't learn hardly anything at all during the lockdown because of a number of reasons, but it's still a huge amount of children.
Well, there's a simple reality that we would always expect sort of schools to be teaching all the way through and supporting pupils. We've set out very clearly as to what those expectations are, as schools have had their full return, but recognising the fact that we've got to deliver a continuous continuity of education for all children, and that's the expectation that is placed on all schools.
Kim.
Sorry, could I just come back on?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, now the children have gone back into school, and well done, we've got 99.9%, I think, of schools reopened, which is fantastic to hear. Are you satisfied that where schools may need to close at least partially to certain bubbles or certain groups of children or year groups of children, that the home provision standards will be high across the board? We will not see children again being left without provision, and that Ofsted will be ensuring that schools are inspected accordingly to ensure that is always the case and that parents can rely on it?
Well, Caroline, as I touched on earlier, that's the clear remit that Ofsted will be doing to ensure that the continuity of education in terms of when they do their inspections has been delivered upon, yes.
Thank you.
Kim.
Thanks, Chair. Secretary of State, following on from previous questions about learning loss and disadvantage. There have been a number of reports by leading institutions about the learning loss that has occurred as a result of lockdown and the greater impact this has had on disadvantaged children and students and the widening of the attainment gap. The promised funding and resources have not reached those most in need. So can you tell us what the DFE are doing to measure this loss at a student level, and how you're working with the regulators to assess what needs to happen as a result of this? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim. And Susan had touched upon the point of some of the work that we've already commissioned and got ongoing in terms of doing that assessment across year groups 1 to 11 to make sure that we have a clear understanding. Also, talking with the teaching profession, there's a clear need that teachers, when they have the pupils in the class, being able to make those important assessments of the needs of those children. That's something that I know is ongoing, and but why we've decided to supplement it with a national study, so that we have a real clear idea as to some of those challenges. And this is why we brought forward the £1 billion package, whether it's National Tutoring Programme or whether that is the COVID catch-up fund. So yes, targeting a good chunk of that money towards the children who are most disadvantaged, but not forgetting those broadly, the fact that children of all backgrounds have suffered as a result of not being in full-time education.
Thanks. Can I also ask as well, because we've heard from various organisations that the number of vulnerable children has increased significantly throughout this period as a result of coronavirus, whether that's due to parents losing jobs or domestic violence. So what assessment has the department done in terms of calculating the extra number of children and the extra resources required to support those children? Thank you.
Well, Kim, as you can imagine, that this has been an unprecedented time for children of all backgrounds, and we are seeing sort of higher referrals than would historically be the case, and we're working very closely with local authorities to ensure that we keep very close to that, and resources that are needed are made available to them.
Can you just clarify how closely you're working and what role you're doing with local authorities to support those needs? Thanks.
Well, absolutely, hand in glove. We're obviously we've not come out of a global pandemic in recent times, so everything that we're learning from this is we're learning about it for the first time, and obviously the issue of children in social care is so incredibly important to the department, and I have no doubt that you'll be having Minister Ford in front of you, who again has been working very closely not only with representative bodies of local authorities, but also local authorities themselves in terms of tackling some of the issues that will inevitably emerge as the fact that we are in a pandemic.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One of the things, and this is a bit of my a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I do want to see, and one of the, it's very difficult, very easy to focus on some of the negatives that come out of extraordinary and difficult situations. But one of the real positives that we've seen is the much closer working that has emerged between schools, between social workers, local authorities, and the police. And and you've seen quite a transformation in a lot of local areas. One of the things I would love to see more of is more social workers actually being based in schools, because actually I think it removes, it makes their job easier. I think actually it removes some of the stigma of actually going to social workers to ask for support and everything else. But we have been supporting local authorities, to the tune of £3.7 billion. And I know in my area, my constituency, how important that extra funding has been to local authorities in order for them to be able to deliver the extra services and extra support that's required from communities that we're all dealing with such a unique set of circumstances.
Can I just say that that's great, that funding, but after 10 years of austerity, hardly touches the surface, and more funding is required to local authorities to meet the needs going forward.
Okay, if I could ask colleagues to try and rattle through the next section. Jonathan Gullis, if you can be as concise as possible, you're next on the catch-up.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, obviously the DFE making the announcement that the National Tutoring Programme is going to have tutoring companies that have only worked with schools means that, we're talking about 2 to 5% of actual tuition companies therefore being able to engage with schools, because 95 to 98% of the profession work in a private capacity. How is that going to help disadvantaged kids with catching up? And how can you be confident, or what confidence do you have that the tutors themselves are sufficiently trained to take up the role in the autumn to help those students in more deprived areas in places like Stoke-on-Trent?
Yeah. Well, it's a very important, really important part of this. We're working very closely with the Education Endowment Foundation, who have pioneered very much pioneered this policy, very much targeted at actually closing the gap of learning loss, especially from those youngsters from most deprived areas. I will take on board your point on the private tutors, and I'll take that up with the policy officials to see if there's more can be done in order to be able to add and build capacity. But one of the key elements that we want to ensure that is the case at every stage is the quality of what's being done is high. And while there's one aspect of the tutoring program, which is obviously very important, but then when we look at the more broader COVID catch-up fund, we wanted to put more flexibility but clear guidance in there, because you see some brilliant examples, whether it's Harris, who are running Saturday schools, so many other organizations. I was with AET that are delivering online specialist tuition that has been made possible by this extra money.
Okay. If I'm asking colleagues to rattle through, can you rattle through answers as well?
I will do.
In your interest, Secretary of State. Jonathan, do you have any more questions?
Just one other, sorry, which is, given that the school closures are widely expected to widen the disadvantage gap, what was the rationale behind the government's decision to provide its 650 million catch-up premium on a universal basis to all schools?
Largely because, that every child has suffered a disadvantage as a result of not being in school. And the idea that, it is possible to draw a circle around one group of children and said they're the only ones who've been disadvantaged wasn't going to be possible. But the reason why that as a pro rata basis, that it was more targeted at children who are most disadvantaged, we recognise that they are the ones who have probably suffered the greatest disadvantage. But we shouldn't underestimate the fact that all pupils have suffered as a result of not having full-time education.
And are you confident you're going to have enough tutors to deliver the scheme all over the country?
We're working very closely with EEF to ensure that's the case, working with lots of organisations to ensure that this can be done. We believe that the creation of academic mentors for the most disadvantaged could have real long-lasting positive effects. So it is a bold step, but I think it is the right step to do.
Ian.
I'm inspired by the chairman of this committee.
Thank you. Ian.
I'm very grateful. I really would be interested in the detail of how you're going to make sure that the tutors are in the right parts of the country where they're most needed, first and foremost, Secretary of State. And given that school closures were widely expected to widen the disadvantage gap, what's the rationale behind just spreading the additional money across all schools? I mean, surely it should be targeted to where it's literally most needed.
So we recognise that a lot of this small group tuition will be delivered online, and that will help obviously smooth some of the challenges there. But if I can just refer you back to how I responded to Jonathan's question, I think that sort of probably picks up the points as to why we made the decision of actually targeting a much bigger proportion of that money towards children who are most disadvantaged, and not forgetting that children who are disadvantaged get the double benefit of not just the targeted tuition funding, but also get the benefit of the overall extra spending on catch-up as well.
Yeah, but there's an awful lot of the youngsters who, from disadvantaged backgrounds, who haven't yet got the benefit of the promised connectivity in terms of IT equipment, the IT equipment itself. And quite often in disadvantaged families, even if they have got a computer, if there are 2 or 3 children, they haven't got access to the computer all of the time when they need it. So we're going to have to think about that. And of course, I would guess, because of the range of private tuition which is available, that will be very different in different parts of the country. I would guess that in the northeast of England or in Merseyside or in Greater Manchester, there are many fewer sort of private tutors per 1,000 population than there are possibly in the home counties.
And that's why being able to deliver for web's incredibly important, but also the one thing that all schools will do, will have resources in terms of computers, and actually there's a real benefit for doing some of that small group working within the school environment, where there's a lot more resource and a lot more support that's readily available.
Ian, I'd like to bring in, because we're pressed for time, I'd like to bring in Christian now, please, who has not had a lot of questions. Christian, okay. And then Tom Hunt, who's finishing, and then Kim has got the last question. Christian.
Thank you, Chair. Ian touched on the comment briefly, obviously, in regards to laptops. Whilst it was very helpful to get those out of date, obviously much more was probably needed. And also, there was very little point in having a laptop if there was no kind of connection at home in order to maximise the use of the laptop. So what thoughts and lessons have we learned from that perspective? But also, what Caroline touched on briefly in regards to the 2 million children who had very little education during lockdown. My fear is that we're going to repeat that when we have local restrictions or local flare-ups. At the moment, I have over 600 children in Bury who are not in education at the moment because of spikes or cases in their schools. Part of the issue in the original lockdown was that there was a lack of guidance from the department for what online learning should be given. So what thought is being taken moving forward to make sure that maximum guidance is given, so not just the bare minimum, but a truly fully rounded education is provided to all children.
So Christian, often one of the criticisms is that we put out too much guidance, but we're continuing to supplement the guidance in terms of where the expectations are of what will be delivered. Your point, we did actually distribute, as well as the over 200,000 laptops and devices, we did actually distribute also over 50,000 routers in order to tackle some of the issues where people didn't have internet connections. That was done through multi-academy trusts and also local authorities. So, but it was then down to them to ensure that sort of local need was met. We're continuing to scale up our provision of laptops. I mean, our purchase and distribution and rollout of laptops was one of the largest, and actually it's been commented actually one of the most successful rollouts, largest and most successful rollouts that's ever been seen. But as you can imagine, procuring that number of laptops at speed from the other side of the globe isn't without sort of considerable logistical difficulties. But we're continuing to work with the major telecommunication companies to improve internet connectivity to the most disadvantaged and vulnerable families. We recognise that in lockdown areas and where schools are suddenly in a position where they're not going to be able to provide learning within the school, the importance of actually having support for that school. That's why we've started the procurement of over 150,000 more laptops in order to support specific schools who've got disadvantaged children to be able to support their learning.
Tom, if you can try and combine some of the questions you have because of time,
okay.
But please fire away.
Okay, so yeah, it's linked to the online learning, and it does seem that in the period that schools were closed, the vast majority of teachers worked incredibly hard to continue to provide top-rate education to the pupils that they're responsible for. However, there do also seem to be some disparities, and I think it's quite clear from some of the surveys and the data that's been produced that though the majority of schools and teachers did go above and beyond in unconventional circumstances to continue to provide education, it does seem there have been some occasions where sadly that did not happen, and that often it's been disadvantaged children who have missed out. So I'd be interested to know from you what plans you've got, particularly if going forward there are further spikes and we have to have a rota system where online learning is here to stay for a while to come. What role Ofsted will play in holding the schools to account and to monitor the quality of the education provided, so that it doesn't disadvantage the disadvantaged.
Tom, you're right to highlight this. So many schools, hundreds of thousands of teachers went absolutely above and beyond for their pupils in terms of the contact, the support, and everything else. But there were some that didn't do as much. What we need to do is continue to raise that bar. We'll continue to flesh out with ever further detail as to what the expectations that we have for schools in order to be able to meet that and what's expected of them. And of course, as you highlight, be a very important role in terms of making assessments. If schools aren't doing that in this period of time, quite simply, when they're inspected by Ofsted, if they're not able to evidence that, that will be reflected in terms of what Ofsted do.
Okay.
And I think it's really important, though, if I could just take one moment, Chairman, I'll be very brief, but just to thank all those teachers, all those teaching assistants, all those support staff, in schools up and down the country who have just done so much, and actually, at every stage, done everything that they can do to help pupils to continue to learn in these most difficult and different of times.
Tom, are you going to ask about SEND now? Please?
Yes.
And if you can combine your two SEND questions, please.
Yes. So, we continue to hear evidence about problems with the SEND system at a local level. Yet my understanding is the government response to date to a previous committee's report seems to reject the idea of greater central oversight of local provision of SEND. What are your thoughts on this? And then secondly, with regards to the SEND review, have you got a date in terms of when that's going to be published?
Yeah. Well, Tom, you sort of rightly highlight the SEND review, and I kind of don't really want to preempt that SEND review in terms of anything that I sort of say here. I do take on board your point about there are inconsistencies in terms of special educational needs provision. You've got the brilliant, and then you've got areas where it's not what we would be hoping or wanting to see. How do we get better consistency across the country is incredibly important. The SEND review will be reporting later than I would have liked to have seen it doing so, but we're very clear that we want to get that data publication not too far off in the
when will it be published? Can't you just tell us when it's going to be published? I mean, it's not a big secret.
It won't be until next year, Mr. Chairman.
So early next year, beginning of next year?
It'll be in the early part of next year, yes.
Okay. And why is it taking so long? Is it to publish the review?
Basically, Mr. Chairman, as you can imagine, an awful lot of resource in the department has been very much focused in dealing with the crisis that we have as a result of a global pandemic. And but the importance and the work streams for the SEND review are absolutely running at full tilt in order to get the SEND review out at the earliest possible stage. And I'm sure Minister Ford will fill you on more details on that. But when we were in this, we are in this crisis, we did have to look at how we put certain resources in different areas.
I mean, you'll be aware of the Panorama report that came out last week on children with special educational needs. And whilst clearly there are still, there is a postcode lottery provision, there is a lot of anguish for parents. They wade through a treacle of bureaucracy. There aren't enough professionals in schools, despite some good things that are happening, and there are real problems with the implementation of the Act. And I just think that this should be a priority for the government, because we shouldn't allow these kind of problems to drag on and on and on, even with the coronavirus.
And this is why we're absolutely committed to publishing it at the earliest possible point and working with experts across this field to ensure that when it is published, this is the right report to publish and takes in the right direction.
Tom, have you finished?
If I could also just quickly add how important it is the incorporation and the work of the Department for Health, because so often when we talk about special educational needs, we are often in danger of ignoring the impact in terms of the integration of delivery of health as part of that package. So we often talk about EHCP plans, but we must never forget the H in this,
But the impression we had from our committee report was that the age part was not quite invisible, but almost invisible of the EHCP.
There's a lot of very useful comments that come out of select committee reports, Mr. Chair.
Tom.
I think one of the benefits, hopefully, of it being slightly delayed is that there is an opportunity now to look at the specific ways in which the lockdown and COVID-19 has impacted SEND pupils. So perhaps, if that slight delay means that it can be added to, and we can really have a sharp laser-like focus at how SEND pupils have been impacted by the lockdown, then that could be welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Certainly.
Kim.
Thank you, Chair. Final question, Secretary of State, is about exclusions and off-rolling. Black and SEND students are disproportionately excluded from schools. Can you explain what measures the Department of Education has or will put in place to ensure that these children and young people are not subject to disproportionate levels of exclusion as they return to educational settings? Thank you.
Well, it is always incredibly important that we have good behaviour policies within school, and this benefits all children, not just those who, including those children that have maybe at risk of being excluded. Statutory guidance on exclusions is clear, and that head teachers should avoid permanently excluding looked after children and pupils with EHC plans as far as possible. Any disciplinary exclusion of a pupil, even for short periods of time, must always be consistent with relevant legislation, and schools should consider underlying factors contributing to poor behaviour before excluding. One of the things that we rolled out at the early part of this year was our behaviour hubs. What's so important about this is actually delivering good behaviour in schools just has a sort of a disproportionate beneficial impact in terms of children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. I think we all sort of remember the experience of being in school where, you do have poor behaviour, and actually how much harder it is for all those other pupils to learn. But actually how that's done, and, it is so incredibly important. And actually the rollout of these behaviour hubs, the impact they have on schools, actually has one of the biggest impacts in reducing exclusions in schools. And that's why strong behaviour policies, strong discipline policies are so vital for helping children of all backgrounds.
Ian.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, I've been written to just last night by primary heads in Gateshead, outlining a number of concerns about the management of their schools during COVID-19, and they are a resourceful bunch. And I was wondering if I could send those concerns on to you as one question. And secondly, the NFER research report that the additional costs of COVID represent about $250,000 for a primary school and $750,000 for a secondary school. That covers all things like supply cover, additional staff that've got to come in, additional capital costs of equipment and separating materials, etc. And also, of course, cleaning materials. So it would be a real shame as a result of all this that the catch-up premium and any additional money for pupil premium was actually spent on that rather than on actually educating the children who most need that support. So what additional resource will be made available by the DFE for schools to cover those additional costs?
Well, as we've seen, Ian, I mean, firstly, the catch-up premium is very much aimed and targeted at the educational, supporting the education of children through extra learning opportunities. So that's where the money should be spent. We had put measures of support in for schools pre the summer, and we keep that constantly under review going forward, and we'll continue to do that, working closely with the sector to listen to their needs.
But the Secretary of State, though, the department have said that the initial expectation is that schools will pick up the costs themselves from September.
Well, Ian, as I just said, we constantly keep this under review, look at it closely, as you'd expect us to do.
Okay.
Just finally, just very quick couple. I mean, the Education Policy Institute has suggested that the attainment levels of disadvantaged pupils compared to their better off peers is 18 months by the time they reach secondary school. I just want to ask you, coronavirus aside, the excellent catch-up premium aside, what is your long-term strategy to deal with the big gaps between attainment levels between disadvantaged pupils and the better off?
Well, as we've seen over the last 10 years, you've seen real strides in terms of driving up standards. What we do need to do is be looking at how we complete that set of reforms in terms of continuing to drive standards ever higher.
Because just to say, sorry, they say that the attainment levels stalled over the last 3 years and potentially could be reversed.
This is why that we need to look at how we drive that harder in terms of raising standards in the the most disadvantaged areas. This is why I think that early years, that early development plays an important and key role in terms of actually how children do, because as you all know, sometimes that gap can open up at the very early stages of a child's development and in those early years. And that start of education. But we're absolutely conscious. Yes, we've got the COVID catch-up fund. The reason that we're putting extra money into schools, that £14.4 billion package, is because we're wanting to drive school standards up right across the country. We want to look at how we drive the use of pupil premium to make sure that that's targeted more at interventions that really drive educational attainment for those children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And let's not forget, there's a significant amount of money that we're always spending on pupil premium that we need to ensure is actually driving those attainment levels for those children.
So you think the pupil premium should be a bit more ring-fenced?
I think we need to ensure that it's always focused at driving the attainment of children that it was designed for.
Or even an annual catch-up fund?
I think I don't think we'll sort of get into spending review just yet, Mr. Chairman.
And have you been supporting private sector innovation and charities like the Invicta Academy, which you're probably aware of, that I think they did something like 36,000 lessons in Kent at a very low cost of about £1.70 or something per head?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, I finished.
Yeah. So I mean, you've seen brilliant innovation both from the charity sector, from schools themselves. Where you mentioned Invicta, you see Reach Academy that was going above and beyond their educational role and actually playing a much bigger role right across their community and delivering meals, 25,000 meals to the much wider community. We want to see that innovation. We want to support that innovation. Obviously, the obvious one is Oak National Academy, but actually how we can see that innovation brought into, playing a role in children's catch-up in terms of actually closing the attainment gap between those who are rich and those who are less well off. That's incredibly important, and it's the state should be enabler of those organisations to be able to play their role.
I felt it was interesting that you said that pupil premium should be more targeted, or perhaps, which is quite an important thing. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I thank your new permanent secretary and also Michelle for coming and answering the questions for such a long period of time. Can I just ask if you'll be able to appear before Christmas, so we can give you at least once before Christmas?
I'm sure I look forward to seeing you in the not too distant future, around the winter period.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and we'll, again, I appreciate you, all of you, for being accountable to the committee today.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.